since we're all first years, I don't know that many people.
Right.
And it's uncomfortable to a friend anyways, because they might not want to talk about personal instances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, that makes sense.
So like the goal she wanted was something like a very, like, to tell a story. It doesn't have to be a personal story, but to give like a narrative, kind of, which you've already done when you're describing like genocide and stuff in the view of a historian. So that's
Right.
great.
Okay.
So it's exactly what we need.
Okay, good.
So yeah, it's recording.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So back.
So I'm sorry, what was your question? Yeah.
So the question was on like, what are your views on restorative justice?
So, it's interesting. It's one thing to talk about war. So, I teach, the other class I'm teaching right now is punishment in modern society. So we've been talking about these topics about sort of genocide and war and terrorism. I've been talking about these with my class all quarter long. This is a topic of great interest to me, and one of the questions that we approach in that context is, can you regulate war through law? Can you use law to regulate war? There's a whole long history to that, which is also a way of saying, can you use, if war is violence, then can you regulate it? Can you use law to regulate the violence of war? A famous military theoretician says that war is combat between two living forces. That's the sort of definition of war. Excuse me. Can you use law to regulate it? And there is a form in the international community that looks at the solution to the problems of what happens after victory comes in the battlefield. That uses restorative justice as part of that process, right? But when I think of restorative justice, I think more in the context of the American domestic system, and America is one of the most violent countries. And if you're tallying up violent criminal acts, right? I mean, America is a super violent country. I don't know if it's the most violent, but it's up there. It's one of the most violent countries, and America incarcerates more people per 100,000 than any other country in the world. It's something like 714 people per 100,000, and it's by far and away the most, incarcerates more people. And so America has gone down a particular path and approach to punishment, punishing criminals that uses mass incarceration. This really is my particular topic of research, right? Prisons and punishment in the United States. So America has kind of an orgy of discipline. One response to that approach, one critique is restorative justice, that other countries do this in their domestic system, and that instead of using mass incarceration, they would use some other approach that falls under the term restorative justice, and that winds up being a critique of mass incarceration, right? That there might be something else that we could do other than simply lock away the quote unquote bad people, whoever they are. I think our system is, our current system, that is ours, the United States, is horribly misguided. There are people that favor abolition, the abolition of mass incarceration. They call themselves abolitionists, or the new abolitionists, and they favor restorative justice as one of the things that you would use to replace the mass incarceration with. I'm fully on board with that, right? Personally, it makes, or maybe you would use some combination of mass incarceration with restorative justice. We seem policy-wise a long way away from that in the context of the United States, but I think it would be great if we began moving down that path. Yeah, and other countries do this, and do it successfully, and their incarceration rates are far lower. And there is a component of our international system, like so, not our international system, but other countries, in the wake of their liberation movement, something particularly of a place like South Africa, with their Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, that used a form of restorative justice as opposed to taking the people who lost out in that context and imprisoning them, right? So instead of imprisoning your enemies after victory, which happens, right, you could move forward in some other way. And that was the path that South Africa has chosen. And there are strengths and weaknesses to that, but it seems to have been largely successful. Right, instead of moving down a more sort of aggressive and violent approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
So have you guys been studying restorative justice as
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've kind of touched up upon it, but we haven't really
yeah.
we've touched on like what it is, but we haven't like where it's been applied necessarily. We've only
Yeah.
looked at like individual cases.
Yeah.
So,
So there's a move afoot in the United States to move more fully down that path, right? And you know, whatever, I don't know, we're doing something horribly wrong in the United States, right? And there are some different ways we can conceptualize violence. I mean, one way to think about violence is to think about, you know, the violent act that the criminal engages in. And that's one kind of violence. But you know, one could also look at the state's response to violence and characterize that as violence, right? Like that the United States responds violently through mass incarceration and as a form of punishment, that's its own kind of violence, right? And it's a violence that's not just done to individuals as they're brought into the criminal justice system, but it's a violence done to the communities that those people come from, right? And so it's a way of there are all kinds of ways one might conceptualize what is violence, right? And where violence resides. And actually, of the large number of peoples in Americans' prisons, many of them are in prison for very long periods of time for non-violent acts, drug laws, having violated America's drug laws. And so, particularly non-violent offenders get enormously long sentences. Well, I would argue that that's a kind of violence, right? That that's the state acting in a violent way to non-violent citizens, right? And so that's its own kind of violence, right? And maybe it's not the kind of violence that produces a sort of physical harm on somebody, although really I think that might not be fair, because prison itself does physical violence to your body, even if nothing happens to you in prison, right? Although something's going to happen to you in prison. That's the nature of prison life, is that it's horrible. But it's also a way of criminalizing and acting with violence to the communities where those criminals largely come from. We could run through the stats. It's not pretty, right? We're talking mostly about African American and Hispanic men, the ages 18 to 34, right? Those are the people who are policed and then wind up in the criminal justice system. Even though, if you do a study of, say, drug use, it's the same across ethnicity. So white guys, black guys, brown guys, like they all use drugs at the same level. They all, right, like drug use actually isn't different among ethnic and class-based groups. What's different is the way we police drugs, right?
So on the topic of prisons, since you're
That's my thing.
yeah, it's you.
Right?
So do you have any? I imagine you've probably visited prisons several times. Do you have any like specific stories from the prisons that may?
Well,
have,
I'm a historian of the 19th century America.
Right.
And so the records and stuff that I've been looking for and at are from another era.
Right.
So I'm not, even though I'm well versed in the literature and policy as it relates to the 20th and 21st century, because I carry my study all the way up through today, my primary focus is on a time period where everybody I'm studying has died, right? And so even when I go to prisons, I'm not going to look for contemporary events and stories. Although so no, the answer to that question is no. I don't have any kind of, I've been to prison and this was sort of my experience. It's usually I'm going to look at their records from a long ago. Does that make sense? Having said that, I did last summer, last April, I went to, there's a famous prison in, I forget, is it Mississippi called Angola? Or is it Parchment? I forget, I get those two confused. Anyway, a famous prison, and I was giving a paper at a conference on mass incarceration in America, and I was giving a history piece, but we took a tour of that prison, and we met some prisoners and talked to them, and asked them questions, and we saw stuff, and it was powerful, right? I mean, it's a disturbing, have you ever been? Like a tour of a prison? Where did you go?
California. prison.
In what context did you do that? Just like you had a free afternoon and.
I was part of a school project. We went to the women's sector.
What was that like?
To be honest, I think it was pretty sheltered because they knew we were all in high school, freshmen, so I think they make sure everything was normal. But I mean, I feel like society feeds you the idea that these people are awful and that they're the most terrifying people ever. But I mean, at least in the situation we were in, strikingly normal. They had conversations with them. And they were all really nice. Well, for the most part, there were some people who didn't want to talk. And
Sure.
I mean, they're in prison. You know, like they evidently are going through some things which are unfair. So I would understand why maybe they just don't want to waste their time talking to a bunch of high school students who don't understand the situation. But I mean, like most of them talked about their families and like how hard it was for them. Over half of them were in there for drugs that they talked to about. There was one person who was on the. I don't know if it was implicated then, but I believe she was on like the 3 count. So it's because none of the crimes she did were serious. Right. But I think that one was like the worst for me because, I mean, you assume people are in prison. I don't anymore, but like when you're younger, because everyone tells you, oh, they're in prison because they're the bad people. But it was like 2 of them was because she got caught stealing from a store because she wanted to feed her kids, and so you're just like your heart kind of sinks. Right. Sure. Yeah, it's kind of it was a strange experience. It didn't feel entirely real. It felt really bizarre. Yeah. And it just I felt like a caged animal because they had guards just everywhere. Sure. That's like their everyday life. It's like, I don't know, you started to feel it. And I mean, it's true, like, the majority of the people there were Black or Hispanic. You can't deny that. You can't pretend it's not true. The statistics are overwhelming. Sure. Yeah. And but there's nothing you can really say. You can't say it's going to be okay, like everything is going to get better. Yeah. There's a movement afoot now in the United States. I mean, one of the things, so, I went down to Pomona to give this talk. Right. And one of the things that I was talking about was that I think it's possible that we're at the cusp of a new civil rights movement, right? That and at the heart of that movement, I think there are 2 things animating that. There are 2 things possibly animating a new push for civil rights in the United States. One is the movement for gay rights, right? And that movement is common, is in full flower, and is in the process of reconfiguring identity to fold gay, lesbian, transgender folks into the body politic as equals. That work is not completed, it's not done, but it's in process, right? And will vary greatly depending on where you are in the United States, but the sort of national conversation on that has been engaged in a really full way. The other component of that is through organizations like the Black Lives Matter movement. That's just one, which is, and at the heart of that movement is an effort to reconfigure the criminal justice system, right, to take on this issue. And so it used to be good politics to raise your hand and say we're going to get tough on crime, right? Which is where the 3 strikes law comes from, in the 1980s. So like we're just gonna a politician goes before his or her constituents and says I'm going to be tough on crime, and my opponent's not, and that's a winning hand for you as a politician for a whole host of reasons. And even if you were uncomfortable with that sort of tough on crime approach, it was so successful that you didn't dare raise your hand as a politician and say, well, I don't know about that, right? Because if you did do that, you didn't get elected. So everyone tried to out-tough each other, right? I'm going to be tougher on crime than the next guy. And that debate now has been, and that's how you end up with the sort of amazingly horrific statistics.